Okay, I will share my screen here and we can get going. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. We're going to go through some really interesting stuff here. Some of you who were at the last MP University may remember the session I did there where I talked about getting management pack data from hard to get data. I was querying an external process and parsing the output here. This one is related. Let's call it related. And so I'm going to go a bit quick through some of the shared areas here. So if you want some more background on this, you can go to our YouTube channel, that's Silex Software on YouTube. There's a playlist for the previous MP University session, and you can go through this if you want. We will also be publishing, of course, this new session today. So I'm going to go through a scenario today, which is probably common to a lot of you people, where we're looking for some data that's available in REST API. So what I want to do here is, let's assume we've got this new Silex cloud. It's critical to our organization, and we want to monitor it to make sure that it is operating within recommended guidelines. And in this example, we're going to monitor whether it's running and how long it takes to fetch some representative data. So I'm going to demonstrate the portal very briefly. I'm going to look at the Swagger UI, which lets you play with the REST API stuff. I'm going to show you how we use that and build a script that we can run outside of Operations Manager to get that sort of data and to measure it. We'll go through that in a lot of detail. There's some tricks there that we'll play with as well. You'll find those very interesting, I hope. And then we'll build that script into a management pack. We'll do a quick run through on discovery to create effectively a watcher node in this case. We'll create a monitor to make sure that we can connect to the operations portal. We'll create a folder. We'll create a performance rule to collect operational data. And I'll also discuss in significant detail cookdown, because the monitors and rules will be sharing exactly the same script, and we can simplify and make things work better if we apply a little cookdown. That's sort of a manual process at this point, but when we get into it, I think you'll see the wisdom of that. So let's take a quick look at this Silex operations portal. I'm going to just log into it here. So logged in, we can do a lot of things here. We can look at existing management packs. So I can drill down through the store, through sealed, Silex. I can look at, let's say, the Silex Windows library here. We can see the various module types and that sort of stuff that's here, unit monitor types. We can do all of that. We can create new management packs, edit to import. And I think Harold will be going through that in more detail later. But what I wanted to show you is what we'll be querying. So we have this ability to look at the changes in the store database. So we can see what has been changed in the last N days. So what I want to do here is I want to select, why is this not expanding? There we go. I'm just going to look for changes in the sealed folder over the last 7 days. And you're going to see some of the data here. The specific data in this case is not terribly important to us, but we want to be able to look at it. If we can query this data, we know that we have programmatic access to the portal. We know that we can connect. We know that we can retrieve data from it, and so everything's working well. Now, to figure out how to do this, with most REST APIs, you're going to find some way of running interactive commands here. In this case, we're set up with Swagger. And Swagger is a tool that sort of automatically goes through the whole API and provides a bunch of different functions here. These are all the things you can do. And as you can see, there's a fair list here. I'm not going to go through most of them. I'm going to just go through basically the first two things. I'm going to go through authentication, and I'm going to go through the audit. We'll just show you how to do that. Now, with most REST APIs, you're going to need to authenticate somehow. And in that case, you've got, when I logged in, you're going to need a username and password, and what you'll typically get back is a token. Now the token can be used to authenticate all the further requests. So let's just take a quick look at that. So if we do authentication, we have to pass in a username string and a password string here. So let's click try it out, and here's where I can actually put in values. Now I'll put in actually the right name I'm going to use, but because I'm screen sharing, I'm not going to put in a proper password here. So we're just going to put in bad password here so you can see what I would do, and then I would click execute. Now because the password's here in plain text, I'm going to flip this off to another screen. I'm just going to type in the proper password here. And I'm going to do the execute. And then I'll flip back to this screen. And what we can see here, and I've got some fake data here, we can see the output. So this is a command you could use with the curl tool to do the same sort of thing. Here's the URL that we're using. And we'll see where this is used. In particular, we're going to see sort of this portion and how that's reused, because this portion is common. And here's what came back. This is the response body. So we got a 200 code, which is success. And we got this body came back, and we have this auth token. Now the auth token, that great big thing that ends with pig, sorry, that's an editorial comment. That's a fairly random thing. I thought that was pretty funny. That's the token that we need. So I'm going to copy that value. I'm going to go back up to the top here. There's an authorize. This is built into Swagger, where we specify the key. Now the format is the word bearer, space, and then a token. So we'll type that in the token, and we'll click authorize. Now, what will happen is that when Swagger executes additional commands, it'll pass in that authentication token. The token can't be reverse engineered to get the original username and password. It cannot be reused forever. It has a certain expiry time. If you're going to do multiple commands, you can reuse the same token many times, but it will eventually expire. And in our case, we're going to execute a command about once every 15 minutes. So in our example, we're actually going to get a new token each time. But I'm going to show you a very cool technique of passing in those credentials so that nobody can see them. They're very well protected. This is built into SCOM. It's a great thing to use. So let's look at the audit report here. So we've already specified our bearer here, so that's taken care of. I'm going to give the tryout. I am going to specify for our name here, I'm going to go with the sealed, so I only want the stuff from the sealed folder for the last 7 days, and I'm going to execute it. And as it returns all the data to me, there we go. So again, there's a curl command you can use, and you can see this the authorization here. I'm not going to be able to select it all, am I? So there's the authorization. There's the word bearer and that token that we typed in that ended with the word pig. Here's the actual the actual URL that was used. You'll recognize that the stuff up to API is common. This is the actual path to query the audit stuff, and the stuff after here with the question mark is the 2 parameters that we've put in. And our results, we're not going to look at these in any great detail, but it's an array, that's what the square bracket means, of a whole bunch of objects, which is store path. This is all the information you would have seen, okay? So this is, and I think you can see from the scroll bar here, there's a lot of data here. So we don't want to pay much attention to that, but I did want to make it make you aware of it, okay? Now, the other thing I want to look at before we get into the code too much is I want to look at our end goal. So in this case, come back over here, I want to have the management pack running. I'm going to create a folder here. I'm going to have a performance view where we can look at In two cases I'm looking at here, the number of audit records, which is why the blue line is fairly constant, and green is the elapsed time in milliseconds that the query took. And so that varies nicely. The little dip to 0 here is, as I was playing around getting this working last night, I had the authentication, the run as credentials, you'll see shortly. I had those broken for one sample, so that is why it went to 0. One of the things you'll notice is that the times were larger here up until about 1 o'clock, and then they got smaller. And I think that must be, no, it's not GMT, it's local time. Basically, I was not doing cook down earlier, so it was making multiple requests, and it made 2 requests at the same time, so they took longer. The information here after is when I am doing cook down, and you can see that it's responding faster, there's less load on things. We'll talk about that in greater detail. And so I have this management pack installed. It's been running so I can get you some data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I would create this management pack from scratch. There's one thing I want to talk about, and we'll come back to this in a bit more detail. But one of the things I have created is a secure reference. So that's this Silent Cloud secure reference here. And with a secure reference, you also decide what credentials are associated with it. And so I have this account name of Silent Cloud Basic Authentication that's been associated with this secure reference. And we're going to get into this in a bit more detail, but I just want to give you a bit of heads up here. So we have this basic authentication credentials here. So it is of type basic authentication. And you look at the credentials here, and you're going to notice one really weird thing about this. In that I have sort of domain /username credentials here, but I have 3 dashes instead of the backslash. The reason for that is that basic authentication credentials do not allow backslashes in them. If I use Windows authentication, it tries to validate those credentials, and they're not on a domain that my operations manager environment has access to, so it would fail. So if I use Windows authentication, then I get alerts thrown for bad credentials. So I've used basic authentication. I have this limitation that I cannot put a backslash in there. So what I've done is I've put 3 dashes in to sort of uniquely give me something I can key on, and we'll change that when we go to use it. So let's go through some of this, and we'll look at this in much more detail. So what I wanted to do is look at the script. And this is where you're going to see a lot of commonality between the last session I did, but you're going to also see the really neat new stuff here. So our script is going to take 2 parameters, the username and password, and these will be passed in from the probe action, which gets them from the data source module type, which gets them from either the unit monitor type or the rule. We'll see that in greater detail. We have some constants here. Script name, event ID, and severity. I've chosen event ID of 2021 because it is 2021. You'd probably want to put some pattern to your event IDs and document them. For this example, we don't. We're going to use the script name so that we have something to put into alerts so we know where they came from. And by default, we're going to log an event at the end of this so that we can track whether things are working. By default, we're going to log an informational event, but if there's problems, we can change the value. Next thing I do is I always initialize all of the variables I'm going to return to benign values. We always want to return all the values, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later, but I like to initialize them so we know that we're going to have something. We're going to record our start time. We're going to record who is running this script. This can really help debug things. And then the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to do, this is sort of boilerplate, we're going to create this new mom script API object, and we're going to create a property bag. Now, a property bag is how rules and monitors return information to SCOM. If you're doing a discovery, there's a different way of doing that. That's beyond our scope today. Now, for debugging, when I run this, I won't have the username and password. So I actually have them in text files on my disk. And when I'm doing debugging, I can just uncomment these 2 lines and read the values in. Now, if you'll recall, when we were looking at the authentication, we had to pass in a username and a value for that username, and we had to pass in the password and a value for that password. Remember I showed you the 3 dashes in the account. This is where we're going to replace them, and we would normally replace them with 1 backslash to have domain backslash username. But this data is going to be sent to the REST API, and single backslashes have to be escaped as 2 backslashes. So I know it gets a little confusing, and you will have to play around with it. It took me a little while to get this figured out myself, but Swagger can really help with that. Once you understand what it is you need to send, it's just a matter of translating the information you have. So because basic authentication doesn't allow backslashes, we put in 3 dashes. We're going to replace the 3 dashes with a backslash to get domain/username, but because it's going across the wire and backslash means something, we actually have to escape it as 2 backslashes. We're going to have the standard accept headers here, which means we'll pretty much accept anything. That's what that means. We define the URI. You'll have recognized that from earlier. So we've now got everything set up. Now, when we actually go to try to run things, we always want to put them in a try-catch handler, and I'll talk a bit more about this a little later. But if something fails, and invoke REST method is the thing that'll fail, we want to be able to catch that and report something sensible. We're going to start a stopwatch because one of the things we're going to return is the elapsed time to do these queries. So we want to start a stopwatch. Here's our authentication request. So we're going to post data to that URI, the /account/authenticate. You'll recognize that from the URL that was used with Swagger. We're going to pass in the headers. We're going to specify our content type is JSON because that's what the body format is, and we'll pass in the data. When this returns, this will fetch the authentication token out of the result. We're going to put the word bearer and a space in front of that token, and we're going to add that to the headers as authorization. And that means that when we use the same headers here in the next REST method, we get the authorization and it'll work for us. So here's where we're going to get, we're actually going to query. So this V1 MP store audit, that's the REST API path to getting the audit data. Our MP name is sealed, so we want the sealed folder, and we want 7 days worth of data. And the only thing we care about here, really, is that it works, that we get a result. Now, I'm going to just get the count of things. Remember I showed you that it was an array that came back? Count will tell us how many items there were, and we're going to assign that to a variable called count. If we get to this point, everything worked. So I'm going to set a message saying successfully retrieved, and I'm going to set the state to healthy. Now, if things fail, we end up in this catch handler. So if there's any programming bugs, we get here, but also if any of these REST methods fail and can't retrieve data for whatever reason, then we'll also get an exception thrown, and we'll end up here in the catch handler. So we're going to set a message telling people that we were unable to retrieve the data. We're going to set this variable called error message to the actual message that's returned. We'll set the event severity to 2, which I think is warning, and we'll set the state to error. When we're finished, we're going to stop the stopwatch and we're going to measure the elapsed time in milliseconds here. Now here's where we put together our property bag where we return things. And I like to, in all cases, return the same properties for everything, and I always want values for them. And if you'll note, the code above has set a value for everything here, even if it's going to be 0. So if there's an error, count was initialized to 0 above. So if one of your rules or monitor actually looks at that, even if it failed, it'll get a 0 back rather than raising an event in the operations manager log. So our state here is either going to be healthy or error. Our elapsed time has been calculated here. The count is what we got here from the audit records, which is this guy here. That's how many records were there. The message was set in either the success or failure case, and the error message was initialized to null, but in the error case we'll set it to the exception message. So we have all the data we want. This returns the property bag to operations manager. I'm going to come back to this in a second, and then we're going to log an event to tell people how things worked. So we measure our end time, we figure out how long it took. We're going to log the script. Here's the script name so that, oops, that was not what I wanted. Here's the script name so we know exactly what it was. Here's our event ID, which was defined above as 2021. Here's our severity, which is either informational if there's no error, or code 2, which I think is warning. Yes, warning. If there was an error, a message script is completed. It was run as, so this is the user that the workflow is run as. And that's a Windows type user. Using account is the username that we're actually running the REST API stuff from. Our runtime was, and then our script time was what we measured above. That's the total elapsed time. And we're also going to return the message and any error message. And so if we were to look, let me just quickly go over here to Win10 to the log, because that's where this is running. We see events here. So they're all going to be the same. I'm not going to bother refreshing them, but here's our information event from the health service script, event ID 2021, and here's our message. The script is completed. It ran as anti-authority system. That's the action account. Using the account, and this is the raw count that we got in. It still has the 3 dashes in it, and that's fine. You know, I'm not too worried about that, but it lets us know that we got the data we want. It ran for 5.25 seconds, and the result was it was successfully received data, and the error string here is empty, so we know that this worked. I probably have one here where it failed from some of my playing around yesterday. I'm not sure these messages are exactly the same, but here's an example. When it failed, it came up as a warning state using account. So this is why it failed. We didn't get any account data here. So it failed in about 1/4 second, unable to retrieve the data from the cloud. And the error, this is the exception that was thrown. Remote server returned an error 400 bad request. REST API calls have a limited set of information they can return. And in this case, bad request meant, I was probably trying to authenticate with a blank user, and so it was going to fail. So those are our events that are logged. Now, we can run this. And let me just very quickly stretch this up a bit at the bottom here. If I run this, it actually works, and it returns system column object. That doesn't tell us much. If I'm debugging this, I can do the following. I can change this so that it does a $API return of the bag. I'm not going to just return the bag. And because we're debugging, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to uncomment these 2 commands, which read those 2 files for the username and password. So now I have all the data I want. And if I run this from PowerShell, not the ISE, PowerShell, I'll run the same script, and there's what's returned. So when I did the $API return on the bag, this is what it actually returns, is a bunch of XML. This is pretty unreasonable here. So what I have is I copied that into XML files, and I brought them up in Internet Explorer, which does a really good job of showing what's in a property bag. So it's a data item. There's some data here. You'll see that this is from the 18th. I can't highlight any of this stuff. And it's a property bag. Here are the various properties. So state, elapsed time in milliseconds, audit records, the error the message, and the error. The error in this case is empty. There was no error message because it was successful. It returned 7,008 audit records over the last 7 days from the sealed folder, and it did that in 2.8 seconds, and the state was healthy. If it fails, we get a similar thing, but in this case, the state is error. It only took 230 milliseconds because it failed out doing authentication. There were 0 audit records, but we have data. We have an error saying that there's a failure, and now we have a good error code here. So bad request. And we can use that in alerts. So I think that's pretty much getting to where we want to go with this. I'm going to undo these changes. I want to make sure that this is back to its correct shape. There we go. And we'll just save that. So you've seen that it runs. You see how to test it. Now we actually want to put this into a management pack. So I'm going back here to my Windows 10 system where I have Visual Studio running with VSAE. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to do a file. I probably could have done it from there. I'm going to do a file, new project. I want to use an Operations Manager 2019 template. I'm going to call it Monitor Select Cloud. In this normal place. We're not really using any .NET in this, so it doesn't matter what version of the framework, but 4.7.2 is a pretty good choice. We're going to keep hitting the back instead of create there, sorry. So here's our project. It doesn't have anything in it right now. And why won't the, there we go. So we have references to a couple of management packs, and that's all there is here. So what we can do is we can create, we're going to start creating a discovery here. So we're going to create a new item. We're going to do it from management pack. We're going to go to the templates, and we're going to go to a discovery. We'll give this a good name here. We'll add this. And so what this does is created a discovery with no good name, no display name, and everything has to be filled in. So we can change the name. We can change the display name here. Anything but without the dots. We want to change the discovery source type ID to a registered discovery provider, filtered registry discovery provider. And we still need to fill in things like the discovery configuration, which is very empty here. So we'd have to know all the XML to put in here. There's a whole lot of stuff we have to do. We also need a class, which we haven't defined yet. And we actually haven't got a class we can put in here. So this is a very interesting way of doing things, but there really has to be a better way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close that. I'm going to delete this. I'm going to show you the better way to do this. And this is using fragments. Kevin Holman's been a big proponent of these. I'm sure some of you have seen his sessions. So let's go through that. So we're going to add another new item, but this time we're going to do it slightly differently. We're going to add code. We're going to add an empty management pack fragment. And we're going to call that Discover Select Cloud. This is the new one. Now this is empty, and it's all XML here. But what we're going to do is we're going to go over. I've downloaded all of Kevin's fragments. Here I have a folder with them. but I also put them into Notepad++, and I'm just going to do a Control-A, Control-C to select all and copy. And we're going to paste that in here. Now we've got 100 lines of good code. And what we need to do is we need to replace a couple of parameters, and we're going to be pretty much set to go. So I'm going to replace company ID with select. And we'll do Control-A to do all, and we've replaced that in 9 places. We're going to replace the app name with select cloud. Oh, actually, I was going to use a different name here. It doesn't really matter, but the application is MPU Spring 2021. Control-A to replace it, and replace it in another 9 places. We need a unique ID for these things. So I'm going to replace that with select cloud. In 11 places, and there's a couple of things we still need to do. We need the path to the registry. Now, what I want to do here is I want to define a way to decide which agents get this watcher node class created on. So what I've done here is I've simply gone into the registry editor under HKLM, a local machine software. I created a folder for select cloud, and I've created one key there for watcher node. And I want to create a watcher node on this computer if this watcher node value has a value of yes. Any other machine that doesn't have this key or it doesn't have the value yes would not get a watcher node created. Now this lets us simply go and make a simple change to one machine or one or more machines, and we would get these watcher nodes created as we need them. So given that path, let's copy that from my OneNote. We'll come back here and we're going to do something slightly different here. I'm not going to just do a replace all because I want to find these. So here is where that path is used. So I'm going to paste that in here. We need to talk about the key. So we want the values. So that's type 1. And type 2 is integer. We actually want string. So I'm going to change this to type 1. And then we come down here where we're going to do our comparison. So equal is fine. That's what we want. But we actually want a string value. And we want a string value of yes. That's all the changes we actually need to make to this. If I build this, there it is, it's built, and we should be able to find, there it is, there's our files, our solution, our project. That's the Discovery Cloud MPX, that's the one we're currently looking at. And under Build Debug, here's our XML. If I open this in Notepad, it's put together, the manifest information, it's put together that list of references. Here's the class definition, here's the discovery that we're talking about. Right down to there's that path that we pasted in. Here's our expression, equal, string value of yes. It's all been put together. It's completely legal, management pack at this point. What we want to do though is we want to add some more stuff. So I'm going to copy this file. I want to copy this. I want to show other tools. So I'm going to bring this back to my main system here. That's the right place. Paste it over here. It's in a different window. You don't see it. And we're going to open this in MP Author Professional. So this is the file we just created at 9:36. I'm going to open it. I happen to be in the, because I did this all yesterday to prepare. Of course, everything's set up here. So this is the same file. There's the class we just created, and the discovery is here. So now we want to add some additional stuff. As I mentioned, we're going to add a secure reference. So we want to target this at our class. And I'm going to give it a very specific name because I'm going to use that same name in other places. So in this case, I don't want to just use the default name here. And I'm going to give it a good display name because we will need to see that in other places. We could put in a description here. I'm just going to leave that as it is. Here's our summary, finish. So now we have a secure reference. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a monitor. By the way, everything I'm showing here in terms of authoring in MP Author Professional is exactly the same in MP Studio. With MP Studio, you get more lifecycle stuff. So you get the store database, you get historical data, you get source code control. There's a lot of additional stuff there. But in terms of editing, it's identical. So we're going to create a Windows script monitor. Now, the management pack we have doesn't have all the referenced MPs that we're going to need, so we're going to add those. So here's our wizard. So it automatically chooses the first class that's in our MP as the target, so that's good. We're going to specify the script name, so we're going to select our script. You'll recognize that. So when we use this wizard, it looks and sees, oh, we have this param here. We have 2 string parameters, and it fills them in as script parameters here for username and value. Now, we don't have values for those, and that's why I wanted to use the specific name for the secure reference, because I'm going to fill that in here. What this says is we want to find a run as secure reference with that name, and we want to dig out the username property of that, and we'll substitute that in for the value that we use for username. And there's a very similar one for password. So there's our properties, our script parameters. We don't know what the username and password will be, but we now have a placeholder for them. This is our health state. Now, I only want a 2 state, so I'm going to get rid of this middle state. And we have this under warning, which is healthy. I want to set the state here, so I want to test the state. I want to test it equal to healthy. Okay, and then in the error in the critical state here, same thing. I want to test that same variable, but quickly here, what is it? Does not equal. I want to use exactly the same value here. Again, as a string. So what we have now is we have a healthy state, which is, that should be equals. This is why you check things. So in the healthy state, if the state variable that's returned in the property bag is equal to healthy, we're going to be a healthy state. In the error case, I may have gotten these backwards. If it does not equal healthy, any other value will be an error state, and in this case, it would be critical. We could also set that to warning, but that's fine for now. We're going to give this a different name here. We're going to call this Silent Cloud Monitor. Hardest part of this job is making sure you don't make typing mistakes while everybody's watching. This is where we can select a run as account to use to run the workflow. Now, in our case, we are using a run as account, but not to run the workflow, because the PowerShell stuff and REST API, none of that actually requires any additional credentials. What we want is the credentials to be used as part of the REST API calls as data to them. So we're not going to select a run as account here. We use the run as account to specify the properties that will be passed into the PowerShell script for the parameters. I'm going to run the monitor every 15 minutes, and we want to generate an alert. And here's where we get to see some really cool stuff. So when we have an alert, what I want to put up is the message property value. That's that success or fail. And since this is an alert, I actually want to put in the property the value that's returned for the error here. And this would be that thing like the error 400 bad request or whatever it was, so that you get the better details here. And there we go. And just click finish. So that's our monitor. Now we're going to do a performance rule, and we're probably not going to have time to get two of them, but that doesn't matter. We want to just create a folder here that we're going to put our views under. We want it under the top monitoring folder here, and we're just going to call this Silent Cloud. We could change the formal name and the description as well, but for time we won't bother with that. That's all it takes to create the folder. You saw that earlier. So let's create our script performance rule. Again, we're targeting the class that we have in this. We'll specify the same cloud. We're going to put in those same values here. And this may seem a little redundant, and we're actually going to undo that a little later, but let's just show you how to create this. The general case, there's our username, password. And here's where we fill in the names of the performance variable that we're going to create. So we're going to use Silent for our object name. Silent Cloud is fine here. This knows what's going to be returned in the property bag. So it's given us a list of what's there. So in this case, for the value, we're going to pull the elapsed time in milliseconds out of the property bag, and we use that as the value. For the instance name, I'm actually going to use that name. So this will create an object of Silent Cloud. The instance will be elapsed time in milliseconds, and the value will be the value from the property bag for the elapsed time in milliseconds. We could give this a better name here. I don't think it matters at this point, so I'll just leave that. Here's our options. We're going to create a view. We could change the name, but I'm not going to, oops. Let's get this the right way here. Here's our folder that we created. Again, I could have given it a much better name. We're also going to save to the data warehouse, but we're not going to bother with a linked report here. And we're going to run this also every 15 minutes. So there's our rule. Now, here's where we need to discuss cookdown. We have a monitor and a rule that are both doing exactly the same thing. They're running that script, they're passing in the same parameters, they're going to return effectively the same data. We don't want to actually have them execute twice. If we do, it doubles the load on the agent, it doubles the network traffic, it's going to double the load on the system we're monitoring, the Silent Cloud. Plus, if we get data from two different workflows, they may not be consistent. So we might get a failure on one and a few seconds later, a success on the other. If we were collecting multiple performance counters, then we definitely want them at the same time. So what we want to do is we want to apply this concept of cookdown. Cookdown basically comes down to if two workflows are using the same data source with the same parameters, it will only run them once and it'll remember the results and reuse those results. So it cuts down on the amount of work that's done on both sides and ensures that they're consistent data. So with our monitor, I'm going to show you the XML here. Our monitor, the data source was this data source, okay? And here's our parameters. Timeout in seconds, interval in seconds, the username and password. I'm going to copy that. What did I just do here? Oh, it scrolled. We're going to copy that. And I'm going to go to the rule. I'm going to edit the XML. And I'm going to cough here in a second. Let me take a drink. You'll notice this data source is very similar. It has timeout values, interval seconds, it has username and password. So we can reuse the same data source here. That's all it took. If we click OK here, we can verify this, and it just gives us a fairly standard warning about unsealed management packs should not contain type definitions, which is our class name. This is a very standard warning you'll get with unsealed management packs. I always ignore it. But what it does mean is that we have these unused module types that we use for the rule. And that is, there's the monitor, there's the performance rule, data source, and probe action. And I'm going to delete those two things because they're not used anymore. And we can verify that everything's there. So at this point, we've put together all the parts and pieces. So we have a completely fine MP here. This is where we would import it into the management group and start to collect the data. If I do that, I don't have any data. These things take 15 minutes to run. The discovery has to run. We'd never see it. We've only got we got about 10 minutes left and we want to answer some questions. So we'll go back and look at the one I created yesterday. So if we go back to the SCOM console here, and we look at the monitoring here, there's the data that we've been collecting. Now I had two rules, one that collects the elapsed time in milliseconds, that's the green line here, and the blue line is the number of audit events, and those two use cookdown, so they only run one single data source, and it's much more efficient. I don't know if we could see it here, if we can get the times here, but they will line up exactly. I'm not sure we can get that, don't worry about it. And I did want to go back over and emphasize what happens here with the profile. So here is the secure reference that we created. The secure reference is a placeholder. It simply says, here's something that you can attach credentials to. That's this account. So we've added that account. The account was the interesting one. That's this basic authentication. Again, just to remind you, I couldn't use Windows authentication because the credentials don't validate on the agent machine because they're for a different domain. So I had to use basic authentication. Basic authentication was not allowing me to put a backslash in there. So I replaced them with 3 dashes and we substitute those at runtime. And we ensure it's only distributed to the agent machine that we're actually interested in. And the result of all that is, come back here, there's our performance view that you can see running. We have no active alerts for that. I have other active alerts, but none of them are for this. If it does stop working, we actually do get alerts and we get that message, the failure message, as well as the exception that was returned from invoke, which would be that 400 bad request sort of message. So at that point, I think we've pretty much gone through everything I wanted to show off. So why don't we look into the question and answers here. I've been talking for 50 minutes. So let's see what else we've got.
Is there something else that you wanted to, you said you didn't have time to show. I don't see anything queued up for you specifically right now. So was there something else, another rule or something you wanted to show earlier?
Okay, there was, so in, where are we here? In this case, this is, what am I looking at here? That's not the case I was looking at. Here in MP Author, we had this one rule. We could create a second rule. This is the one looking at, yeah, it smells the easiest thing. We're looking at the elapsed time here. So the second rule is fairly similar to the first, and I'll go through this very quickly. Same script. This is going to recreate similar stuff, and I'll just show you the cook down there, how we get rid of that as well. So there's our value for the username, our value for the password. We want to use the same object name, static cloud, but in this case, we're looking at the number of audit records. So we'll use that as the instance name, and we'll pull that value out of the property bag. By default, it's you trying to use the same name here, so I'm just going to change something here. We don't need to make things longer, but let's just, that'll solve the problem of the conflicting names here. We don't need to create the view, and I'll show you how to fix that. We do want it to run every 15 minutes here. There we go. So if I get this to resize properly. So here's our audit performance rule, and here's our elapsed time rule. So with the elapsed time rule, we had specified the monitor data source. So in this one, we want to use the monitor data source as well. We don't need our own data source for this. Let's save that. I didn't tell it to write to the data warehouse, which we probably want to do. I probably should have done that. So we'll copy this, which is the write action, which writes to the data warehouse. And we'll make sure that gets in here as well. And we have module types that we need to get rid of. So here's our monitor ones. So these are the ones that we don't need anymore. And our view that was created, that includes the first rule. We want to also include the second rule. We can actually finish that. That's everything we need. And with that, again, we only have that same warning about unsealed management packs should not contain type definitions that we don't really care about. And now we have a view that's looking at the data for two different rules, which is how we got this view. So again, it's two different rules. I think you can actually see the rules here. This is the audit records is blue, the elapsed time in milliseconds is green. They're using cookdown, so they both collect the data from the same property bags, and everything is perfect. So I hope that shows you how to do these sorts of things. We'll make some of this available to you. The tricks we've gone through with debugging, so you can help with that sort of stuff. So you can do the debugging outside of Operations Manager, how you can display the results if you go through PowerShell itself, not the ISE. Surprisingly, the ISE will never display anything other than system column object, no matter how hard you try. But PowerShell itself does. How to deal with things like basic authentication that won't let you put in all the characters you need. There may be other cases where you needed to substitute. As I said here, we really only want one slash, but because this data is going across the wire, it had to be escaped as two slashes. You may actually need to do some other escaping there, and you'll just have to deal with that as it comes up. But I hope this has given you a good heads up on how to start with this stuff. And a couple seconds left. So Harold, any further questions or anything?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mike. Well, yeah, I have a question. Are we able to make this this work available to the attendees? The
Yes.
MPs? Perfect. Okay, so we'll include that in our follow-up package that we'll be sending out. I do have a couple questions, Mike. One of them is from Raj. And the question is, I have configured a rule in my custom MP to collect the performance data, but performance view is not collecting any data or perhaps showing any data. How can I troubleshoot it?
That's a great question. The performance view isn't showing any data. Does the counter show up? So if it's collecting, if it knows that the rule is collecting anything, the counter would show up here in the legend. But if there's zero data showing up here, so the counter shows up, it thinks it's collecting, but if nothing shows up in the graph, there's two things that could be well, there's a couple things that could be happening. One is until there are 2 data points that have been collected, you won't see anything in the graph. It won't show just a dot for one data point. So if your performance rule, for instance, was collecting once a day, it could take up to 48 hours before you'd see that first little line segment show up here. The other thing is you may have played around with date ranges, and there's a whole bunch of customization you can do here under personalized view. You can set x-axis, so you could set the x-axis so that you can't see the data, things like that. So make sure you're set to automatic there. Not sure what else. Those are some things you could start with. I just don't know what else it could be. If the data is being collected by a script, make sure you log events, and you can put out as much data in your event log as you want to make sure you know what's being returned. The other thing is to look at the event logs on both the agent machine where the data is being collected and your SCOM server to see if there's anything there. SCOM does a very good job of logging a whole bunch of events. And very quickly, if we just look at errors, I'm just trying to see if there's anything useful here. There may be a sensible error here. You know, things aren't heart beating, data dropped. That's puzzling. SDK service exception throw-on. You know, there's a lot of information there. So if you look, you may find that you've simply got a name wrong and it doesn't match, something like that. But there should be signs of it in the event log. Next.
There was another question about the APIs, which I'm just responding to. So I'll take care of that. And if you have any other questions for Mike, we're actually just heading into a short break. So if you have any other questions for Mike, please go ahead and send them in. And in the interim, we're just going to take a very short break. Mike is going to monitor those questions and respond to them as he can. And we're going to be back in about 10 minutes for a deep dive session on HTML5 development within SCOM. So thanks so much, Mike, for that. And again, we'll just take a very short break and be back to you within about 10 minutes or so. Thank you.